The Arctic, the last blank spot on Earth. For centuries it had swallowed explorers whole, turned ships into coffins of ice, and reduced the boldest expeditions to footnotes in maritime tragedy. To the Soviet Union, this frozen wasteland was more than geography. It was destiny, a wall of eternal ice that stretched across the top of the world like nature's own iron curtain. Soviet cartographers drew their maps with confidence, marking vast expanses of white with a single word: НЕПРОХОДИМО, impenetrable. Their admirals spoke of it in briefing rooms lined with red banners, voices heavy with certainty. "The Arctic is our shield," they declared. "No enemy vessel can cross what God himself has frozen." But in March 1958, somewhere deep beneath hundreds of feet of solid ice, that certainty began to crack. An American submarine, the USS Nautilus, moved through water where no vessel was ever meant to go. Soviet sonar stations recorded only silence. Their reconnaissance flights saw nothing but endless white. "Impossible," one Kremlin admiral sneered when the first rumors reached Moscow. "Our scientists have proven the ice is eternal. The pressure alone would crush any machine." Yet on a night when the polar twilight stretched across the world's most desolate frontier, something impossible happened. A periscope broke through the ice where the Soviet Union believed no human technology could exist. The Americans had done it. They had cracked the final frontier of the Cold War. And the world never knew. Not until decades later, when fragments of declassified files revealed a truth more extraordinary than fiction. The mission that changed everything almost never made it back. In the sterile corridors of the Ministry of Defense in Moscow, Soviet naval strategists gathered around tables covered in Arctic charts. The maps told a story of absolute natural defense, a frozen moat that stretched 4,000 miles across the top of the world. Every line drawn in blue ink represented another barrier: pressure ridges that rose like underwater mountains, ice sheets thick enough to crush battleships, and magnetic anomalies that could send compasses spinning into madness. "Comrades," Admiral Sergei Gorshkov addressed his staff, his finger tracing the northern boundary of their empire. "The Arctic has protected Russia for 1,000 years. The Mongols never crossed it. Napoleon never dreamed of it. Even the fascists turned back before its gates." The science supported their confidence. Soviet polar researchers had spent decades mapping the ice cap's behavior, documenting temperatures that plunged to 70 degrees below zero, winds that could tear flesh from bone, and ice formations that shifted like tectonic plates. Their reports filled classified cabinets with clinical precision. No submarine technology exists capable of sustained operations beneath permanent ice cover. Hull pressures exceed all known material tolerances. Navigation impossible due to magnetic field disruption. Dr. Mikhail Somov, the Union's leading polar scientist, had staked his reputation on these conclusions. Standing before the Academy of Sciences in 1957, he declared with academic authority, "The Arctic Ocean remains the one place on Earth where Soviet sovereignty is guaranteed by physics itself. No submarine can survive beneath the ice pack. The electromagnetic interference alone would blind any navigation system. Even if such a vessel somehow reached the North Pole, it would find only solid ice above. No place to surface, no way to communicate with the outside world." The audience of distinguished scientists nodded in agreement. Mathematics supported Somov's conclusions. The ice cap averaged 12 feet thick across most of the polar basin. But pressure ridges, formed where ice sheets collided and buckled, extended 30, 40, even 60 feet beneath the surface. Any submarine attempting to navigate this underwater labyrinth would be caught like a mouse in a maze of ice. But 4,000 miles away, in the cramped office of Admiral Hyman Rickover in Washington, a different conversation was taking place. Maps covered every wall, but these charts bore different markings. Depth soundings taken by experimental probes, temperature readings from Arctic research stations, and theoretical calculations about nuclear propulsion in extreme environments. "Gentlemen," Rickover said to his gathered staff, his voice carrying the weight of classified authority, "the Soviets believe their northern frontier is impregnable. They've convinced themselves that nature has built them the perfect defense." He paused, studying a photograph of the USS Nautilus during sea trials. "History has shown us that whenever someone declares something impossible, we must consider the possibility that they're simply afraid to try." The USS Nautilus represented something revolutionary. The world's first nuclear-powered submarine. Unlike the diesel-electric boats that had prowled beneath the waves during World War II, Nautilus could remain submerged for weeks without surfacing. Her nuclear reactor generated not only propulsion, but also the electrical power to create oxygen, purify water, and maintain life support systems for extended underwater operations. Commander William Anderson, recently assigned as the submarine's captain, studied the Arctic charts with growing fascination. Where Soviet maps showed barriers, he began to see possibilities. The ice that Moscow considered a wall might actually provide cover, a frozen ceiling beneath which an American submarine could move undetected across the top of the world. "The technology exists," Anderson told Rickover during a classified briefing in late 1957. "Nautilus has already proven she can operate submerged for over 60 days. Her sonar systems can map ice formations. Her nuclear plant can provide power and heat indefinitely." He traced a finger along the polar route. "If we could navigate beneath the ice pack, we'd accomplish something unprecedented, a transit of the Arctic Ocean without ever surfacing." Rickover leaned back in his chair, considering the implications. Such a mission would represent more than a technological achievement. It would shatter the Soviet Union's fundamental assumption about their northern defenses. If an American submarine could cross beneath the Arctic ice undetected, what else might be possible? Unknown to the Americans, Soviet polar research stations scattered across the Arctic ice pack had been recording strange anomalies throughout the winter of 1957. Station Nord 7, established on an ice floe roughly 300 miles from the North Pole, reported unusual acoustic signatures picked up by their hydrophones. Senior technician Pavel Kurdin had been monitoring underwater sounds for 3 years, cataloging the Arctic Ocean's natural symphony, the grinding of ice sheets, the calls of marine life, the distant rumble of seismic activity. But in February 1958, his instruments detected something different. "It's rhythmic," he reported to Moscow in a coded transmission. "Like machinery, but too regular for natural phenomena. The frequency suggests propulsion, but that's impossible. No vessel operates in these waters during winter." The report reached Dr. Somov's desk within hours. After reviewing the data, he drafted a confident response. "Technician Kurdin's instruments are detecting ice movements amplified by underwater acoustics. Similar phenomena have been documented in Lake Baikal during severe freezes. No further investigation required." But Kurdin wasn't convinced. Night after night he listened to the sounds through his headphones, a distant humming that seemed to move in straight lines across vast distances. Sometimes the signal would fade for hours, then return from a different direction. It reminded him of something he'd heard during his naval service, the sound of a submarine's propeller, filtered through water and distance. On March 3, 1958, the signal stopped entirely. The Arctic Ocean covers nearly 6 million square miles, roughly the size of Antarctica. In 1958, it remained one of the least explored regions on Earth. While scientists had mapped its coastlines and cataloged its ice formations, the deep ocean beneath the polar ice cap remained largely mysterious. What was known painted a picture of extraordinary harshness. Winter temperatures regularly dropped below -50 degrees Fahrenheit. Storm systems generated winds exceeding 100 miles per hour. The ice pack itself moved constantly, driven by currents and weather patterns that could split massive sheets like breaking glass. For submarine operations, the challenges seemed insurmountable. Conventional boats required access to the surface for air and battery charging. Even nuclear submarines needed occasional communication with naval commands. Beneath the polar ice cap, both requirements became impossible. A submarine might travel for thousands of miles without finding open water. Radio signals couldn't penetrate the ice barrier. If something went wrong, rescue would be impossible. Soviet naval doctrine dismissed Arctic submarine operations as fantasy. Their own attempts at under-ice exploration had ended in disaster. In 1954, a classified mission had sent the diesel submarine B-67 beneath the ice edge near Franz Josef Land. The boat returned 3 days later with a cracked pressure hull and a crew suffering from hypothermia. The official report concluded, "Extended operations beneath ice cover present unacceptable risks to vessel and personnel." But the Americans possessed something the Soviets lacked: a submarine that could remain submerged indefinitely. If Nautilus could navigate the underwater ice formations, if her sonar could map safe passages, if her crew could endure weeks of isolation beneath the polar cap, she might accomplish what military strategists had long considered impossible. In the Kremlin, confidence in Arctic impregnability had become more than military doctrine. It was psychological armor against Cold War anxieties. While American bombers flew practice runs near Soviet borders, while NATO expanded its alliance eastward, the Arctic remained inviolate. Soviet leaders could sleep soundly knowing that their northern frontier was protected not by armies or missiles, but by nature herself. This certainty permeated Soviet culture. Propaganda films showed heroic polar researchers conquering the ice for scientific glory. Children's books celebrated explorers who planted red flags on floating ice sheets. The Arctic wasn't just Soviet territory. It was proof that the socialist system could triumph over any challenge. But certainty, as Admiral Rickover understood, could become weakness. The more convinced the Soviets became of their Arctic fortress, the less likely they were to prepare for its potential breach. Their radar stations faced south toward Europe and west toward Alaska. Their naval patrols concentrated on traditional shipping lanes. The vast underwater realm beneath the polar ice cap remained unguarded because Moscow had convinced itself it was unguardable. On March 4, 1958, that assumption was about to be tested. In the classified depths of the Pentagon, a plan was taking shape that would challenge every assumption about Cold War geography. The operation bore an innocuous code name, Sunshine, that masked its revolutionary intent. For the first time in history, an American warship would attempt to cross the Arctic Ocean by traveling beneath the ice pack from Alaska to Greenland. The mission had originated in the fertile imagination of Admiral R. Lee Burke, Chief of Naval Operations, who understood that psychological warfare could be as powerful as nuclear arsenals. If the USS Nautilus could traverse the Arctic underwater, the achievement would shatter Soviet confidence in their northern defenses while demonstrating American technological supremacy to the world. But the operation required unprecedented secrecy. Soviet intelligence networks monitored American naval activities with obsessive attention. Every submarine departure was cataloged, every crew assignment analyzed, every training exercise scrutinized for hidden meaning. To succeed, Operation Sunshine would need to hide in plain sight. The deception began with paperwork. Official orders directed Nautilus to conduct routine training exercises in the North Atlantic. Her departure from New London would appear no different from dozens of previous missions. Port workers would see the submarine leave with standard provisions for a 2-week patrol. Even the crew's families received form letters describing normal operations in regional waters. Only Captain Anderson and his senior officers knew the truth. 3 months of intensive planning had produced detailed charts of Arctic ice conditions, contingency plans for emergency surfacing, and protocols for long-term submerged operations. Soviet maps of the Arctic Ocean had been studied and restudied until every depth sounding and current pattern was memorized. The USS Nautilus herself was a marvel of 1950s engineering, a testament to American technological ambition. At 324 feet long and displacing over 4,000 tons, she dwarfed conventional submarines. But her most revolutionary feature lay deep within her hull, a pressurized water reactor that could generate steam for propulsion and electricity for life support systems without requiring surface air. Traditional submarines were actually submersibles, surface ships capable of diving for limited periods. They relied on diesel engines for surface travel and battery-powered electric motors for underwater operations. Every 12 to 24 hours, They had to surface or raise a snorkel to run their diesels and recharge their batteries. Nautilus represented a fundamental breakthrough. Her nuclear reactor eliminated the need for air-breathing engines. Her steam turbines could operate indefinitely underwater. Her batteries were reserved for emergency situations. In theory, the submarine could remain submerged for months, limited only by food supplies and the psychological endurance of her crew. These capabilities made Arctic operations feasible. Conventional submarines attempting to cross the polar basin would need to surface repeatedly, breaking through ice or finding leads of open water. Nautilus could remain safely submerged for the entire transit, using sonar to navigate and her nuclear plant to maintain comfortable living conditions despite the crushing cold above. Commander Anderson had handpicked his crew of 116 officers and men. Each sailor underwent extensive background investigations and psychological evaluations. The Arctic mission would test their endurance, their discipline, and their ability to maintain operational security under extreme stress. One careless word in a waterfront bar could compromise the entire operation. Creating a believable cover story required elaborate choreography. Nautilus would depart New London on March 8th, ostensibly for training exercises with NATO forces near Iceland. The submarine would travel north through the Atlantic, maintaining normal radio schedules and following predictable navigation patterns until she reached the edge of the polar ice pack. Meanwhile, naval intelligence launched a campaign of strategic misdirection. False documents suggested that Nautilus was testing new sonar equipment in the deep waters off Newfoundland. Decoy radio traffic indicated routine patrol schedules. Other submarines were positioned to create electronic signatures that might confuse Soviet monitoring stations. The psychological element was equally important. Crew families were told to expect normal communication schedules. Base personnel continued routine maintenance on Nautilus's berth, suggesting her prompt return. Even the submarine's departmental heads were given incomplete information about the mission's duration and objectives. Only 6 men aboard Nautilus knew their true destination: Captain Anderson, his executive officer, the navigator, the sonar officer, the chief of the boat, and the nuclear reactor control officer. Everyone else would learn their mission's purpose only after they had committed to it irrevocably. On March 8, 1958, at 0800 hours, USS Nautilus slipped her moorings at the Naval Submarine Base, New London. Families waved from the pier as the sleek black hull moved steadily down the Thames River toward Long Island Sound. Children held handmade signs reading, "Come home soon, Daddy," smiled with practiced confidence, accustomed to their husbands' mysterious absences. Within the submarine's steel hull, normal routines continued. The engineering crew monitored reactor parameters. Sonar operators tracked surface shipping. The cook prepared lunch for 116 men who had no idea they were beginning the most dangerous submarine mission in history. Anderson stood in the control room, studying charts of the North Atlantic, while maintaining casual conversation with his officers. Nothing in his demeanor suggested that these were anything but routine waters. But in his locked safe lay sealed orders that would transform this training exercise into a race against nature herself. As Nautilus submerged off Montauk Point, her last visual contact with the surface world disappeared. For the next 3 weeks, she would exist in an underwater realm of darkness and pressure, guided only by sonar echoes and the steady rhythm of her nuclear heart. The mission parameters were both simple and terrifying. Nautilus would proceed north through the Labrador Sea, then northwest through Davis Strait toward the entrance to the Arctic Ocean. Once beneath the permanent ice pack, she would attempt to navigate underwater to the North Pole and beyond, eventually surfacing somewhere in the Greenland Sea. If successful, the mission would prove that American submarines could operate anywhere in the world's oceans. If they failed, 116 men would disappear beneath the ice without trace or explanation. As Nautilus headed north, the psychological pressure of secrecy began affecting her crew in subtle ways. Sailors accustomed to sharing their experiences with friends and family found themselves unable to discuss their daily routines. Letters home became exercises in creative fiction. descriptions of normal patrols and routine maintenance that revealed nothing about their true activities. Senior Chief Bosun's mate Paul Early, a veteran of World War II submarine patrols, sensed something different about this mission. The crew seemed more focused, more disciplined than usual. Officers spent unusual amounts of time studying navigation charts. The normal joking and conversation that characterized submarine life had been replaced by a kind of professional intensity he'd seen only in combat. "Boys are wound tight," he confided to Chief Torpedo Man Ralph Pryor during their off-duty hours. "This ain't no training exercise. Command's got something special planned." But speculation was dangerous aboard a submarine. Rumors could spread through the crew like wildfire, undermining discipline and operational security. Anderson had made clear that loose talk would result in immediate transfer and loss of security clearance, career death for professional submariners. Instead, the crew focused on their duties with unusual precision. Engine room personnel monitored nuclear reactor parameters with microscopic attention. Sonar operators listened to underwater sounds with almost supernatural concentration. Navigation teams plotted courses and calculated positions with mathematical obsession. Nautilus was becoming more than a submarine. She was transforming into a machine dedicated to a single purpose that none of her crew yet understood. On March 12th, 4 days after departure, Nautilus encountered the southern edge of the Arctic ice pack, roughly 200 miles north of Newfoundland. The transition was gradual, scattered bergs floating like white monuments, then larger sheets of broken ice, and finally a continuous canopy that blocked all sunlight from the surface. Sonar technician First Class Alfred Charrier had been tracking ice formations on his scope for hours. The acoustic signatures were unlike anything in his training manuals. Massive underwater projections that extended dozens of feet below the surface, creating a three-dimensional maze of obstacles. "Captain to sonar," Anderson's voice came through the intercom. "Sonar aye, sir. We're picking up heavy ice formations bearing 090 through 180. Looks like solid pack ice extending to maximum sonar range." Anderson studied the sonar display, watching green traces paint pictures of the underwater ice landscape. What he saw resembled an inverted mountain range, peaks and valleys of frozen water that could crush his submarine if he miscalculated their positions. This was the moment of decision. Beyond this point, Nautilus would be committed to underwater operations beneath solid ice. If her sonar systems failed, if her navigation equipment malfunctioned, if her nuclear reactor experienced problems, she would be trapped beneath a frozen ceiling with no possibility of emergency surfacing. Anderson picked up the submarine's intercom microphone. Throughout Nautilus, 116 men stopped their activities to listen. "This is the captain. For the past 4 days, we have been proceeding north under training orders. Those orders have now changed." He paused, allowing the significance to settle. "We have been selected for a special mission that will test every system aboard this boat and every man in this crew. We are going to attempt something that has never been done before. A submerged transit of the Arctic Ocean from the Pacific to the Atlantic." Silence followed his announcement. Then gradually, excited conversations began throughout the submarine. They were no longer on a routine patrol. They were making history. "All stations report readiness for extended submerged operations. We will be proceeding north under the polar ice pack. There will be no opportunity to surface until we reach the other side." Anderson's voice carried both confidence and warning. "What we accomplish in the next 2 weeks will remain classified indefinitely. You are not to discuss this mission with anyone. Not your families, not your friends, not even other submariners. The security of this operation may determine the outcome of the Cold War itself." As Nautilus descended beneath the ice pack, her crew understood they were crossing more than a geographical boundary. They were entering a realm where human technology had never ventured. A place where failure meant death, and success meant changing the balance of world power. The last traces of sunlight disappeared above them, replaced by the eerie green glow of the sonar scopes and the steady hum of the nuclear reactor. They were alone beneath the ice, farther from rescue than any submarine in history. The real mission was just beginning. At 13:47 hours on March 12th, USS Nautilus crossed beneath the permanent ice pack of the Arctic Ocean. The transition was marked not by ceremony, but by the sudden disappearance of the last traces of natural light filtering through the water column. Above them stretched an unbroken ceiling of ice that would extend for thousands of miles, a frozen barrier between the submarine and the rest of the world. Sonar technician Alfred Charrier watched his scope with new intensity as acoustic returns painted increasingly complex pictures of the underwater ice formations. What had seemed manageable near the ice edge now revealed itself as a three-dimensional labyrinth of staggering complexity. Pressure ridges, formed where ice sheets collided and buckled upward, extended 40, 50, even 60 feet beneath the surface. Some formations resembled underwater cathedrals, their frozen spires reaching down like the fingers of a buried giant. "Jesus Christ," whispered Seaman Apprentice David Powell, staring over Charrier's shoulder at the sonar display. "It looks like we're flying through an upside-down city." The comparison wasn't far from accurate. Ice formations created by years of Arctic storms and pressure had built structures of fantastic complexity: arches and tunnels, peaks and valleys, chambers large enough to hide destroyers and passages so narrow that Nautilus would have to navigate with inches to spare. The submarine's sonar could map these formations with reasonable accuracy up to about 2,000 yards. But beyond that range lay unknowable dangers. Captain Anderson stood behind the sonar operators, studying each new formation as it appeared on their scopes. Navigation beneath the ice required split-second decisions based on incomplete information. Too deep, and Nautilus would risk exceeding her safe operating depth. Too shallow, and she might collide with an ice projection that could rupture her pressure hull. "Depth under keel?" Anderson asked. 230 feet, sir," replied Chief of the Watch John Michaud. "Bottom soundings show 1,800 feet of water beneath us." The numbers provided little comfort. While the ocean floor lay far below, the ice ceiling above created a constantly shifting maze of obstacles. Each pressure ridge represented a potential trap, passages that might narrow without warning, leaving Nautilus wedged between ice formations with no room to maneuver. As Nautilus pushed deeper into the Arctic ice pack, the psychological pressure began affecting her crew in ways that submarine service had never prepared them for. Traditional underwater operations offered the comfort of eventual surfacing, the knowledge that fresh air and open sky waited above. Beneath the polar ice cap, that comfort disappeared entirely. Engine man second class Robert Regal found himself checking his watch obsessively, calculating how long they had been submerged. 3 days, 4 days, a week. Time began to lose meaning in the submarine's artificial environment. The normal cycle of day and night, governed by sunlight and darkness, ceased to exist. Only the steady rhythm of watch rotations marked the passage of hours. "It's like being buried alive," Regal confided to his bunkmate during off-duty hours. "Every time I think about that ice above us, I can't breathe right." The sensation wasn't uncommon. Dr. Lyon, the submarine's medical officer, had noticed increased reports of minor ailments, headaches, insomnia, digestive problems, that he recognized as symptoms of psychological stress. The human mind, evolved over millions of years to function in open environments, rebelled against prolonged confinement beneath crushing weights of ice and water. But discipline held. Each man aboard Nautilus had volunteered for submarine service, accepting the inherent risks and psychological challenges. They had trained for months in confined spaces, learning to function efficiently despite claustrophobic conditions. What they hadn't trained for was the knowledge that escape was impossible, that the surface world had become unreachable until their mission was complete. Anderson felt the weight of command more acutely than anyone. Each navigation decision balanced the submarine's safety against the mission's objectives. Conservative choices might protect his crew, but could also result in mission failure. Aggressive navigation increased their chances of reaching the North Pole, but multiplied the risks of collision or entrapment. The captain's daily log entries, written in his private cabin, revealed the strain. Day 6 under ice. Ice formations more complex than anticipated. Crew performance remains excellent despite psychological pressure. Navigation requires constant attention. No margin for error. We are truly alone up here. Beneath the Arctic ice pack, Nautilus moved through an acoustic environment unlike anything in human experience. The submarine's sonar systems painted pictures with sound, transmitting brief pulses of acoustic energy and analyzing the returning echoes to create maps of their underwater surroundings. But ice, the crew discovered, was not simply frozen water. It was a living thing, constantly moving and reshaping itself under the influence of currents, temperatures, and atmospheric pressure. The polar ice cap groaned and cracked with sounds that resembled artillery fire. Pressure ridges ground against each other with the screech of tearing metal. Deep within the ice formations, pockets of trapped air expanded and contracted with changes in temperature, creating drumbeats that resonated through the water like distant thunder. Sonar operator Frank Adams had been listening to underwater sounds for 8 years, but the Arctic presented acoustic challenges that defied his experience. Ice formations created echoes that bounced and rebounced between surfaces, generating false returns that could confuse navigation. Temperature variations in the water column bent sonar pulses in unexpected directions. Most disturbing of all, the ice seemed to absorb certain frequencies entirely, creating acoustic shadows where their instruments went blind. "It's like trying to navigate through a hall of mirrors with your eyes closed," Adams reported to his division officer. "Every sound bounces off something else. Sometimes I can't tell if we're looking at ice or ghosts." The acoustic signatures became the crew's primary connection to their environment. They learned to identify different types of ice formations by their sonar returns: the sharp, clean echoes of solid pressure ridges, the diffused responses from broken ice fields, the hollow resonances of underwater caverns formed by melting and refreezing. But the sounds also carried psychological weight. In the deep silence of the Arctic Ocean, every mechanical noise aboard Nautilus seemed amplified. The hum of electrical equipment, the whisper of air circulation systems, the distant throb of the nuclear reactor. These familiar sounds became a lifeline to human technology in a realm where nature reigned supreme. On the 7th day beneath the ice, Nautilus encountered her first serious emergency. At 0324 hours, while navigating through a particularly complex field of pressure ridges, the submarine's primary ballast control system began malfunctioning. Chief Petty Officer William Laylor was monitoring ballast tank operations from his station in the control room when warning lights began flashing across his panel. "Captain to control," he called out. "Emergency blow valve number 3 is not responding. We're losing positive buoyancy control." Anderson arrived in the control room within seconds, his trained eyes scanning the ballast control indicators. The malfunction was serious but not immediately catastrophic. Nautilus could maintain her current depth, but fine adjustments to her buoyancy, essential for precise navigation beneath ice formations, were becoming increasingly difficult. "Take her down to 400 feet, Anderson ordered. "Get us some maneuvering room while we troubleshoot the problem." As Nautilus descended away from the dangerous ice formations overhead, her crew began emergency repairs that would test their technical expertise under impossible conditions. The ballast system controls were located in compartments throughout the submarine, some accessible only through hatches that required partially flooding adjacent spaces. Machinist Mate First Class Kenneth Carr volunteered to enter the flooded ballast tank compartment to manually operate the malfunctioning valve. Working in near-freezing water with only emergency lighting, Carr spent 3 hours making repairs while wearing a bulky survival suit that restricted his movement. "Valve is responding manually," Carr reported through his communications headset. "But the electrical control circuits are corroded. Looks like seawater intrusion somewhere in the system." The repair work continued for 18 hours while Nautilus maintained a careful depth beneath the ice pack. During this time, the submarine consumed precious battery power and began falling behind her planned navigation schedule. More critically, the ballast system failure highlighted how vulnerable they were to mechanical problems while trapped beneath the ice. If Nautilus suffered a major flooding emergency, her ability to surface quickly could mean the difference between survival and disaster. But beneath the polar ice cap, emergency surfacing was impossible. The submarine would have to find a lead of open water or attempt to break through ice formations that could be dozens of feet thick. "We're walking a tightrope," Anderson confided to his executive officer. "Every system aboard this boat is critical now. We can't afford another malfunction." As Nautilus pushed deeper into the Arctic Ocean, her crew began experiencing psychological effects that submarine training had not anticipated. The knowledge that they were farther from rescue than any human beings in history created a unique form of mental stress that manifested in different ways among different personality types. Some sailors became obsessively focused on their duties, checking and rechecking equipment with compulsive attention to detail. Others withdrew into themselves, speaking only when necessary, and spending their off-duty time writing letters that might never be sent. A few experienced periods of acute anxiety, reporting to sickbay with symptoms that had no physical cause. Petty Officer Second Class James Sordelay, normally one of the submarine's most gregarious crew members, had stopped participating in the card games and conversation that typically filled off-duty hours. He spent his free time staring at engineering diagrams, memorizing system schematics with photographic precision. "You feeling okay, Jimmy?" asked his friend and shipmate Terry McCrary during their meal period. "Just thinking about home," Sordelay replied. "My wife doesn't even know where I am. For all she knows, I could be dead at the bottom of the ocean." The comment reflected a concern shared by many crew members. Their families had been told to expect regular communication during what was supposed to be a routine training exercise. When days passed without word from Nautilus, wives and parents would begin to worry. By now, some families might have contacted the Navy seeking information about their missing fathers, sons, and husbands. But no information could be provided without compromising the mission's security. The families of Nautilus crew members would have to wait in ignorance until the submarine completed her Arctic transit and resumed normal communications. For some families, the wait would last more than 3 weeks. This knowledge weighed heavily on the crew's morale. Submarine duty required accepting extended separations from family, but this mission imposed a different kind of burden. The knowledge that their loved ones were experiencing unnecessary anxiety because of operational security requirements. By the 10th day under ice, Nautilus had traveled more than 200 miles beneath the polar cap, farther north than any vessel in history. Their position, calculated by dead reckoning and inertial navigation systems, placed them roughly 300 miles from the North Pole, deeper into the Arctic Ocean than human beings had ever ventured. But navigation beneath the ice pack presented challenges that tested the limits of 1950s technology. Traditional navigation methods relied on visual or radio fixes from known landmarks. Beneath the polar ice cap, both were impossible. The submarine's gyro compass, designed to point toward true north, became increasingly unreliable as they approached the magnetic North Pole, where compass readings became erratic or meaningless. Navigator Lieutenant Commander Robert McWethy found himself relying on dead reckoning calculations that accumulated errors over time. Each course change, each speed adjustment, each estimate of current drift introduced small inaccuracies that could compound into major navigation errors over hundreds of miles. "We're basically flying blind," McWethy admitted to Captain Anderson during one of their daily navigation conferences. "Our position estimates could be off by 50 miles or more. If we encounter unexpected ice formations, we might not know whether to go around them to port or starboard." The uncertainty was maddening for men trained to operate with precision. Submarine warfare demanded exact knowledge of position, course, and speed. Lives depended on accurate navigation. Yet beneath the Arctic ice cap, they were forced to operate on faith, trusting instruments that might be lying, following courses based on educated guesswork, and hoping that their calculations would prove accurate enough to avoid disaster. Anderson studied their chart positions with growing concern. According to their estimates, Nautilus should encounter the North Pole within the next 2 days. But if their navigation was significantly off, they might miss it entirely, wandering beneath the ice pack until their food supplies ran low and fuel exhaustion forced them to attempt emergency surfacing through ice that could be impenetrably thick. "All we can do is trust our training and our equipment," Anderson told his officers. "We've come too far to turn back now." The submarine pressed northward through the darkness, guided by sonar echoes and the steady pulse of her nuclear heart, carrying 116 men toward a rendezvous with history, or disaster. On March 17th, the 11th day of their Arctic odyssey, USS Nautilus approached the most symbolically significant point on Earth, the geographic North Pole. For centuries, this mathematical abstraction had represented the ultimate goal of polar exploration, the final prize that had cost dozens of expeditions their lives and consumed the dreams of nations. Navigator Lieutenant Commander McWethy hunched over his charts in the submarine's cramped navigation compartment, making calculations that would determine their place in history. Dead reckoning suggested they were within 50 miles of 90 degrees north latitude, closer to the North Pole than any vessel had ever traveled underwater. But uncertainty plagued every calculation. Their gyrocompass had become increasingly erratic as they approached the magnetic pole. Drift calculations relied on current estimates that might be completely wrong in these uncharted waters. Even their speed measurements were suspect, as water density variations could affect the submarine's actual velocity through the water. "Captain to navigation," Anderson's voice crackled through the intercom. "Navigation, aye, sir. What's our best estimate of current position?" McWethy studied his charts one final time before responding. "Sir, based on dead reckoning from our last known position, I estimate we are approximately 25 miles southeast of the North Pole. Course 270 should put us over the pole within the next 6 hours." The announcement spread through Nautilus like electricity. Crew members gathered in small groups, speaking in hushed voices about the magnitude of what they were attempting. Some sailors who had never shown interest in exploration found themselves studying Arctic charts, trying to comprehend the significance of their position. Sonar technician Charrier monitored his instruments with renewed intensity, searching the ice formations ahead for any indication of their proximity to the pole. But the Arctic ice pack showed no respect for human mathematics. Pressure ridges and ice formations followed the dictates of wind, current, and temperature, creating the same chaotic landscape they had navigated for hundreds of miles. At 23:15 hours on March 17th, Lieutenant Commander McWethy announced over the submarine's intercom, "All hands, this is navigation. Based on our dead reckoning calculations, USS Nautilus is now crossing the geographic North Pole." The moment passed without fanfare. No bells rang, no ceremonies marked the occasion. In the control room, Captain Anderson noted the time in the submarine's log with characteristic understatement. "Crossed North Pole at 23:15, continuing on course 270 degrees true." But throughout Nautilus, men understood they had achieved something unprecedented. They were the first human beings to reach the North Pole by submarine, the first to cross this mythical point while completely submerged, the first to prove that the Arctic Ocean's frozen ceiling could not stop American naval power. Engineman Robert Riegel, who had struggled with claustrophobia during their early days under ice, found himself overwhelmed by the historical significance of their achievement. "We did it," he whispered to his watch partner. "We actually did it. We're at the top of the world." The psychological impact rippled through the crew in unexpected ways. Men who had maintained professional composure for nearly 2 weeks suddenly found themselves fighting back tears. The North Pole represented more than a geographical waypoint. It was proof that human ingenuity could overcome any natural barrier, that American technology could go anywhere on Earth. Yet their triumph remained incomplete. Crossing the North Pole was only the halfway point of their journey. Ahead lay another 1,000 miles of ice-covered ocean before they could attempt to surface in the Greenland Sea. The most dangerous part of their mission still awaited them. 36 hours after crossing the North Pole, USS Nautilus encountered the most serious emergency of her Arctic voyage. At 03:47 hours on March 19th, while navigating through a particularly dense field of pressure ridges, the submarine's nuclear reactor began experiencing control problems that threatened to shut down their primary power source. Engineering Officer Lieutenant Commander Eugene Wilkinson was monitoring reactor parameters when warning alarms began sounding throughout the engineering compartment. Temperature readings from the reactor core were fluctuating wildly, indicating potential problems with the control rod systems that regulated nuclear fission. "Captain to maneuvering," Wilkinson called out. We have indications of reactor control problems. Requesting permission to conduct emergency shutdown procedures, Anderson arrived in the engineering spaces within minutes, his face grave as he studied the reactor control panels. A nuclear reactor shutdown beneath the Arctic ice pack would be catastrophic. Without reactor power, Nautilus would lose propulsion, electrical generation, and life support systems. Battery power could sustain basic operations for perhaps 12 hours, but not long enough to reach the ice edge. "What's your assessment?" Anderson asked Wilkinson. "Sir, control rod movement is sluggish. We're getting erratic responses to control inputs. Temperature fluctuations suggest possible control rod binding. If we lose reactor control entirely, we'll have to scramble the reactor and shut down." The technical language masked a terrifying reality. If Nautilus lost nuclear power while trapped beneath the ice pack, her crew would face a race against time to reach open water before their batteries died and life support systems failed. In the sub-zero temperatures of the Arctic Ocean, the submarine would become a tomb of ice within hours of losing power. Reactor Technician Chief Petty Officer Paul Spear volunteered to enter the reactor compartment's most dangerous areas to manually inspect the control rod mechanisms. Working in high radiation fields while wearing bulky protective equipment, Spear spent 4 hours diagnosing the problem. "Found the issue," Spear reported through the communication system. "Ice formation in the reactor compartment ventilation systems. Cold air circulation is causing metal contraction in the control rod housings. We need to increase compartment temperature and cycle the controls manually." The solution required delicate engineering work while the submarine continued navigating through dangerous ice formations. For 18 hours, Nautilus's engineering crew worked around the clock to restore full reactor control while the submarine ran on reduced power and limited maneuvering capability. During this crisis, the crew's discipline and training proved decisive. Despite the knowledge that reactor failure could mean death for all 116 men aboard, each sailor continued his duties with professional competence. No one panicked, no one questioned orders, no one abandoned his post. "These boys are the best submarine crew in the Navy," Anderson noted in his personal log. "Under circumstances that would break civilian minds, they respond with nothing but dedication to duty. Whatever happens, they've proven themselves worthy of the mission." As Nautilus continued her westward journey beneath the Arctic ice pack, the psychological toll of extended submerged operations began manifesting in ways that surprised even experienced submariners. Crew members reported vivid dreams about sunlight and open spaces. Some sailors experienced brief episodes of disorientation, momentarily forgetting where they were before reality reasserted itself. The submarine's artificial day-night cycle, maintained through lighting controls and watch rotations, provided structure but could not replicate the natural rhythms that governed human psychology. Men found themselves sleeping at unusual hours, eating without appetite, and experiencing mood swings that ranged from elation to despair within short periods. Dr. Lyon, the submarine's medical officer, documented these effects in his confidential medical log. Extended submerged operations under ice present psychological challenges beyond normal submarine duty. Crew members are experiencing symptoms consistent with sensory deprivation and situational anxiety. Recommend future Arctic missions include specific training for psychological adaptation to prolonged ice operations. But the crew adapted with remarkable resilience. Card games resumed in off-duty compartments. The submarine's small library circulated worn paperback novels until every book had been read by dozens of men. Someone organized trivia contests that became intensely competitive, with questions ranging from baseball statistics to engineering principles. Music became particularly important for maintaining morale. The submarine's small collection of records played continuously on the crew's sound system. Everything from classical symphonies to popular songs that reminded the men of home. Que sera, sera by Doris Day became an unofficial anthem, its optimistic message resonating with men who had committed their lives to an uncertain mission. Food took on symbolic significance beyond mere nutrition. The submarine's cooks worked overtime to prepare special meals that provided psychological comfort. birthday cakes for crew members celebrating while submerged, elaborate dinners that created a sense of celebration during their underwater isolation. Most importantly, the crew began developing a shared identity that transcended individual fears and doubts. They were no longer simply 116 men trapped beneath ice. They were pioneers, explorers, representatives of American technological achievement. This collective purpose gave meaning to their isolation and strength to endure whatever challenges remained. By March 20th, Nautilus had been submerged beneath Arctic ice for 8 continuous days, traveling more than 1,500 miles through waters no human had ever seen. Their position, according to dead reckoning calculations, placed them roughly 600 miles from the Greenland Sea, still deep within the polar ice pack, but approaching the theoretical edge of permanent ice cover. But the Arctic Ocean seemed infinite. Each day brought new ice formations, new navigation challenges, new evidence that the polar ice cap extended farther than American intelligence had estimated. Charts based on surface observations and theoretical calculations proved inadequate for understanding the underwater reality of Arctic ice distribution. Sonar returns continued showing complex ice formations extending to the limits of their detection range. Pressure ridges created underwater mountains that forced Nautilus to navigate around obstacles the size of city blocks. Temperature variations in the water column bent sonar beams in unpredictable directions, creating false echoes that could confuse navigation. Most troubling of all, their sonar operators began detecting ice formations that extended deeper beneath the surface than anything in their reference materials. Some pressure ridges reached 80 or even 90 feet below the waterline, depths that could trap Nautilus if she attempted to surface in the wrong location. "It's like the ice is getting thicker as we head west," sonar technician Adams reported to his division officer. "The formations are more complex, more extensive. Some of these ridges look like underwater cliffs." Navigator McWethy shared Adams's concerns. Their charts showed the Greenland Sea ice edge approximately 400 miles ahead, but those charts were based on surface observations that might not reflect underwater ice distribution. If permanent ice extended farther west than expected, Nautilus could find herself trapped beneath solid ice with no possibility of surfacing. "We're operating on faith now," McWethy confided to Captain Anderson. "Our charts may be completely wrong about ice distribution. We could surface into solid ice 20 feet thick, or we could miss the ice edge entirely and surface in a storm." Anderson studied their position estimates with growing concern. Nautilus had sufficient food and fuel for several more days of submerged operations, but not indefinitely. If they couldn't find open water soon, they would be forced to attempt emergency surfacing through whatever ice lay above them, a procedure that could crush the submarine's sail and flooding the boat. The decision facing Anderson was brutal in its simplicity: continue west toward uncertain open water, or begin emergency surfacing procedures while they still had enough power to break through ice if necessary. At 0630 hours on March 21st, after 9 days beneath the Arctic ice pack, sonar technician Adams detected something that made his heart race with excitement. Among the familiar acoustic signatures of ice formations and ocean currents, his instruments picked up a sound that seemed impossible: the distant rumble of surface waves. "Control, sonar!" Adams called out, his voice barely containing his excitement. "Control, aye. I'm detecting surface wave action bearing 270 degrees. Range approximately 30 miles. Sounds like open water, sir." The announcement electrified Nautilus's control room. Surface waves meant the end of solid ice cover, the beginning of the open ocean that would allow them to surface and communicate with the outside world. After more than a week of navigation based on faith and calculation, they had found their way to freedom. But caution remained essential. The sonar contact could represent a temporary lead in the ice pack rather than the true ice edge. Leads, channels of open water created by shifting ice, could close without warning, trapping any vessel that attempted to surface. Nautilus needed to approach carefully, using sonar to map the extent of open water before committing to surfacing procedures. Anderson ordered the submarine to periscope depth while still beneath solid ice, allowing their sonar systems to get clearer readings of the open water ahead. The maneuver required precise navigation, too shallow, and they would collide with ice formations, too deep, and their sonar would lose resolution. "Periscope depth," reported Chief of the Watch Me show. "Up scope," Anderson ordered. As the periscope broke through the surface, Anderson found himself looking up at something he had almost forgotten existed: natural light. Above Nautilus, ice formations created a frozen cathedral of white and blue, with narrow channels of dark water visible between the ice flows. "We've reached the ice edge," Anderson announced to his crew. "Prepare for surface operations." Throughout the submarine, men cheered with joy and relief that had been building for more than a week. They had done it. They had crossed the Arctic Ocean underwater, navigated beneath the polar ice cap, and emerged into open water on the far side of the world. But their mission remained incomplete. Until Nautilus surfaced completely and transmitted her position to Naval Headquarters, the achievement would remain unconfirmed. The final phase of Operation Sunshine was about to begin. At 09:47 hours on March 21, 1958, USS Nautilus began her ascent from the depths of the Greenland Sea toward a surface she had not seen for 9 days. Throughout the submarine, crew members secured equipment and prepared for the return to normal surface operations. The transition from underwater to surface running required careful coordination of ballast, trim, and propulsion systems. Anderson stood in the control room, monitoring the submarine's ascent with careful attention to depth gauges and ballast controls. After their extended submerged operations, surfacing procedures required extra caution. Ice formations could still pose hazards even in areas of open water. 100 feet, reported the diving officer. 80 feet. 60 feet. 20 feet. Surface, surface, surface! USS Nautilus burst through the surface of the Greenland Sea like a black whale emerging from the depths. Water cascaded from her sail and deck as she settled into normal surface trim. Around the submarine, ice flows drifted in the Arctic current, but channels of dark water extended to the horizon in all directions. Anderson climbed through the submarine's hatch onto the bridge, breathing natural air for the first time in 9 days. The Arctic atmosphere was brutally cold, temperatures well below freezing with wind that cut through clothing like knives. But it was surface air, fresh and clean and infinite in its abundance. "Signal bridge, prepare to transmit position report," Anderson ordered. Within minutes, radio messages flashed from Nautilus's transmitters toward naval communication stations thousands of miles away. The first message was brief and cryptic: Nautilus 90 north. But those 3 words carried revolutionary implications that would reshape Cold War naval strategy and shatter Soviet assumptions about Arctic impregnability. As Nautilus rode the surface swells of the Greenland Sea, her crew gathered on deck to witness the completion of their historic mission. They had traveled 1,830 miles beneath Arctic ice, crossed the North Pole while submerged, and emerged on the opposite side of the world's most forbidding ocean. Behind them, the Arctic ice pack stretched toward the horizon like a white wall that had been proven permeable. Ahead lay the Atlantic Ocean and the journey home to families who had waited in ignorance and anxiety for more than 2 weeks. But first, there were photographs to take, positions to confirm, and messages to send. USS Nautilus had accomplished something unprecedented in naval history, and the world was about to learn that the Arctic Ocean was no longer an impenetrable barrier to American submarines. The age of underwater Arctic operations had begun. Within hours of USS Nautilus surfacing in the Greenland Sea, a machinery of secrecy more sophisticated than the submarine herself began obscuring the true nature of her achievement. The initial radio message, Nautilus 90 north, reached the Pentagon at 13:47 hours Washington time, triggering a cascade of classified communications that would bury the mission's most significant details for decades. Admiral R. Lee Burke, Chief of Naval Operations, understood immediately that Nautilus had accomplished far more than a symbolic crossing of the North Pole. The submarine had proven that American nuclear vessels could operate anywhere in the world's oceans, including areas the Soviet Union considered absolutely secure. This capability represented a revolution in naval warfare, and a strategic advantage that must be protected through careful information control. The classification process began before Nautilus reached port. Crew members were ordered to sign additional security agreements that prohibited discussion of operational details indefinitely and without exception. The submarine's log entries were edited to remove technical information about ice conditions, navigation methods, and sonar capabilities. Even photographs taken during the mission underwent scrutiny to ensure they revealed no classified information about submarine operations. Captain Anderson found himself walking a careful line between public recognition and operational security. The Navy wanted to publicize Nautilus's achievement for its propaganda value while concealing the strategic implications of successful Arctic submarine operations. The result was a narrative that emphasized adventure and exploration while minimizing military significance. The American people deserved to know about this historic achievement, Anderson was told during his Pentagon briefing. But they don't need to understand how it changes the balance of naval power. Keep the focus on human courage and American technological superiority. Leave the strategic analysis to others. In Moscow, the news of Nautilus's Arctic transit created shockwaves that reached the highest levels of Soviet leadership. For months, American claims about submarine capabilities had been dismissed as propaganda, technological boasting designed to intimidate rather than inform. The successful Arctic crossing shattered those comfortable assumptions with brutal finality. Premier Nikita Khrushchev summoned his naval advisors for an emergency briefing within hours of learning about Nautilus's achievement. The questions he asked revealed the depth of Soviet miscalculation. How could American submarines operate beneath ice that Soviet scientists declared impenetrable? What other capabilities might American nuclear vessels possess? Most troubling of all, how many other American submarines might already be operating in waters the Soviet Union considered secure? Admiral Sergei Gorshkov, who had built his reputation on confident assertions about Arctic impregnability, found himself defending fundamental assumptions about naval geography. "Comrade Premier," he explained with visible discomfort, "our intelligence services underestimated American nuclear propulsion capabilities. We believed extended submerged operations were impossible due to air supply limitations. We were wrong." The admission carried devastating implications for Soviet naval strategy. If American submarines could cross the Arctic Ocean undetected, they could potentially operate in the Barents Sea, the Baltic, or even approach Soviet naval bases through routes previously considered impossible. The entire foundation of Soviet maritime defense required immediate reconsideration. Within weeks, the Soviet Union began the most massive Arctic research program in its history. Nuclear icebreakers, previously used for scientific exploration, were converted for military reconnaissance. New sonar stations appeared along the Arctic coast. Submarine construction programs received unlimited funding for vessels designed specifically for under-ice operations. But the Soviet response revealed the true magnitude of American achievement. By proving that nuclear submarines could operate beneath Arctic ice, Nautilus had forced the Soviet Union to invest billions of rubles defending against capabilities they had never imagined possible. American public reaction to Nautilus's Arctic crossing reflected the carefully crafted narrative that emerged from Pentagon briefing rooms. News reports emphasized the adventurous aspects of polar exploration while downplaying military implications. Magazine articles compared the mission to historic voyages of discovery, focusing on human courage rather than strategic consequences. The crew of Nautilus found themselves celebrated as explorers and adventurers, roles that felt strange to men who understood they had participated in a military operation of profound strategic significance. Parades welcomed them home, but the parades celebrated a sanitized version of their achievement that bore little resemblance to their actual experience. Sonar technician Adams, who had spent weeks listening to the acoustic signatures of Arctic ice formations, found himself unable to discuss the technical challenges that had made their mission so dangerous. When reporters asked about underwater navigation, he could only offer generic responses about following standard procedures and relying on excellent equipment. "It's like they want us to pretend it was easy," Adams confided to his wife after a public appearance. "They don't want people to know how close we came to never coming back." The enforced silence frustrated crew members who had participated in something unprecedented, but found themselves unable to share the full story even with their families. Letters home remained generic and uninformative. Conversations with friends avoided operational details. The most significant experience of their naval careers became a source of isolation rather than connection. Years passed before crew members could discuss even basic details of their Arctic transit. Decades would pass before the full story emerged from classified files and aging memories. Behind the public celebration of American technological achievement, classified research programs were analyzing every aspect of Nautilus's Arctic performance to develop capabilities that would remain secret for generations. The submarine's sonar logs contained acoustic signatures of Arctic ice formations that had never been documented. Her navigation records provided data about underwater magnetic anomalies, current patterns, and ice distribution that would guide future Arctic operations. The intelligence value of this information was immeasurable. Future American submarines could use Nautilus's experience to plan more efficient Arctic transits, avoiding the dangerous ice formations that had threatened the first mission. Nuclear attack submarines could approach Soviet naval bases through polar routes that Moscow considered impassable. Ballistic missile submarines could operate beneath Arctic ice, using the frozen ceiling as protection against enemy detection and attack. Dr. Waldo Lyon, the Navy's leading expert on Arctic oceanography, spent months analyzing Nautilus's data to develop new techniques for under-ice operations. His research remained classified for decades, but it laid the foundation for submarine capabilities that would give American naval forces decisive advantages throughout the Cold War. What Nautilus accomplished was more than exploration, Lyon noted in his classified research summary. She proved that the Arctic Ocean can be treated as an extension of American territorial waters, accessible to our forces and denied to our enemies. This represents a strategic revolution in naval warfare. The revolution remained invisible to public view, hidden behind layers of classification and misdirection that would protect American submarine capabilities long after the Cold War ended. As years passed and Cold War tensions evolved, pieces of the Nautilus story began disappearing from official records. Logbook entries were reclassified or destroyed. Photographs vanished from archives. Crew members discovered that their service records contained gaps where Arctic mission details had been removed. The systematic erasure wasn't accidental. As American Arctic submarine operations became routine, the original breakthrough mission became a security liability. Future submarine capabilities could be compromised if potential enemies studied the techniques that had made the first Arctic crossing possible. Commander Anderson, promoted to higher rank and assigned to other duties, found himself unable to write a complete memoir of his Arctic command. "There are things I still can't discuss," he admitted in interviews decades after the mission. "Some aspects of what we accomplished remain classified, and I suspect they always will be." Crew members experienced similar frustrations. Men who had participated in one of naval history's most significant achievements found their stories edited, sanitized, or simply removed from public view. Their children grew up knowing their fathers had done something important but receiving only vague descriptions of what actually happened. The process created a peculiar form of historical amnesia. Americans celebrated Nautilus's achievement without understanding its significance. The mission became a footnote in Cold War history, rather than recognition of the strategic revolution it represented. Modern researchers attempting to reconstruct the complete story of Nautilus's Arctic mission encounter obstacles that suggest the classification process continues decades after the events themselves. Critical documents remain restricted or have been destroyed. Former crew members, now elderly, still refuse to discuss operational details they learned as young sailors. The persistent secrecy raises questions about what aspects of the mission remain sensitive after more than 60 years. Did Nautilus encounter Soviet submarines or installations during her Arctic transit? Were their technical problems more serious than those revealed in official accounts? Most intriguingly, was the 1958 mission actually the first American submarine crossing of the Arctic, or were there earlier, completely hidden attempts? Historians have found references to Arctic submarine experiments dating to the early 1950s, including mentions of missions that achieved limited success or provided valuable data for future operations. But details of these earlier efforts remain classified, creating gaps in the historical record that may never be filled. The enduring mystery reflects a broader pattern in Cold War history, achievements that were simultaneously celebrated and concealed, creating public narratives that bore little resemblance to underlying realities. Americans learned that their submarines could cross the Arctic Ocean, but they never learned how that capability would reshape global naval warfare. Today, as climate change transforms the Arctic Ocean and new nations compete for polar resources, the legacy of Nautilus's 1958 crossing takes on renewed significance. The ice that once seemed eternal has begun retreating, opening shipping lanes and revealing mineral deposits that nations are eager to claim. But beneath the changing surface, the strategic principles established by Nautilus remain relevant. Submarines continue operating in Arctic waters, using techniques developed from her pioneering voyage. The Arctic Ocean has become a routine operating area for nuclear vessels, no longer the forbidden frontier it represented in 1958. Yet something essential was lost when the Arctic ceased being impenetrable. The mission that broke the final barrier also destroyed one of Earth's last great mysteries. The white void that once challenged human imagination became another ocean to be mapped, navigated, and exploited. Perhaps this was always inevitable. Human history is largely a story of barriers overcome, frontiers crossed, impossibilities proven possible. The Arctic represented the last geographical limit on planetary exploration. After Nautilus's crossing, no ocean remained beyond human reach. But in conquering the Arctic, we also lost something irreplaceable: the knowledge that some places remain beyond our capabilities, some frontiers exist to humble human ambition. The ice that once protected Soviet shores also protected human wonder at the vastness of an unconquerable world. The deepest truth about Nautilus's Arctic crossing may be that it represented not triumph but transformation, the moment when Earth became completely known, completely accessible, completely subject to human technology. The submarine that proved nothing was impenetrable also proved that mysteries were becoming extinct. In Moscow, Soviet leaders who had once found comfort in Arctic impregnability learned that geography no longer provided security. In Washington, American strategists discovered that technological capability created obligations and vulnerabilities they hadn't anticipated. Throughout the world, people began to realize that the age of undiscovered country was ending. The crew of Nautilus achieved something unprecedented, but they also participated in something irreversible. They crossed the last uncrossable barrier, solved the final geographical puzzle, and proved that human ingenuity could overcome any natural obstacle. Their achievement was magnificent. It was also an ending. The Arctic Ocean had been conquered, but in victory, something eternal was lost beneath the ice. The mystery of places human beings could never go, the knowledge that some frontiers would always remain beyond our reach. Perhaps that knowledge, more than any strategic advantage, was what the classification truly sought to protect. Not the technical details of how barriers were broken, but the profound sadness of discovering that no barriers remain unbreakable. The ice remembers everything and reveals nothing. Beneath its frozen surface, the Arctic Ocean keeps its own counsel, indifferent to the submarines that now traverse its depths as routinely as automobiles cross continental highways. But sometimes, in the deep silence of polar night, when wind moves across endless ice under stars that shine with Arctic clarity, the ocean whispers a truth that human achievement cannot silence. Some victories are indistinguishable from loss. Some conquests leave conquerors diminished, and some secrets are worth keeping, not because they protect nations, but because they preserve wonder. The Soviets were right about one thing: the Arctic was impenetrable. We simply chose to penetrate it anyway, and in doing so, we discovered that the world's last frontier had been protecting something more valuable than strategic advantage. It had been protecting mystery itself. And now that mystery lies buried beneath the ice, classified indefinitely, never to surface again.